Hopefully everyone is in. They can see my screen and they can hear me. If there's any issues with doing that, let us know. We'll sort it out. And throughout my presentation, if you want to follow along with the slides or review them again later, the link is the first link here on the screen. And the link below that, the short link, that's Plugin Workshop, that is a link to a GitHub repository we're going to be using. And the code also is organized based on the steps in the presentation. So you'll be able to follow along directly with that. And I'll pull that up so you can take a look at it shortly. And the link to that will be at the bottom. Someone comes in late or you need to find it after we get started. So first I want to thank everyone for coming to an online version of CMS Philly. It's been, interesting trying to do everything from home. I've been doing an in-person workshop, but I think we're still gonna have fun. I want to do really quick introductions. My name is David Wolfpaw. I own a WordPress maintenance business called FixUpFox. I focus on ongoing support and maintenance for my clients. And I also work with SiteGround as a WordPress ambassador. I've been using them for my hosting for the past 7-8 years or so. And they make it easier for me to attend events like this. So one last reminder, that is where you can find all of the information that we're going to be using during this presentation. And for you to review later, or you can look at it now while we're going through it. But my hope is that it will help you to be able to step through the code the same way that we're going through it here, so you can see the plugin get built a little bit at a time. Now, during live demonstrations, something always goes wrong. So to try to ensure that doesn't happen, what I'm instead going to be doing is showing the code snippets here and then some screenshots of the outcome. It'll be as opposed to, trying to code all live here, switching my screen between the code editor and the browser and then the slides, and, fairly having the internet go out or something. And I'm just pausing for whatever feedback that is. All right, I think we're good. So the first thing that you're going to do is you need to create a folder for that plugin to live in, and you need to create the first file that is going to contain the code for your plugin. Now the plugin that we're building is going to be fairly simple. I'm going to show you what it looks like. It is a notification bar, basically something you can place at the top or bottom of the screen on your site, where you can put something like, sign up for a newsletter, or we're having a sale today, or maybe information about the closures and everything, that you might be having right now related to your website. It's fairly simple, but it can cover a lot of different things that you would be doing when building any WordPress plugin. This includes including scripts and styles in your plugin, using the customizer, using the settings API, using WordPress hooks, functions. So in any WordPress site, you're going to have whatever your top level folder is for your website. Beneath that, there should be several folders: a WP admin folder, WP content, WP includes. Those are all the core files that make WordPress run. So we're going to start, we're going to look in the WP content folder, and there should already be a folder in there called plugins. That is where all the WordPress plugins live. So we're going to create our own folder in there. In this case, I'm calling it folder notification bar. The only real concern here is that you don't want to use any special characters, no spaces. I would just stick to lowercase, alphanumeric, and hyphens. You'll also have to be concerned if your folder name conflicts with another one. I usually prefix, whatever I'm going to create here. So like if it's for a specific, add the client name into that folder, or I'll add the business name in so that, people know where it came from. In this case, I'm keeping it shorter just so, it doesn't look too confusing. And then within that folder notification bar, we're going to create a PHP file, which is going to be the index for our plugin. normally the default here is to use the name of the folder as the name of the file, because WordPress is going to try to look for a file of that name in the folder first. That's because people have blank index PHP files or index HTML files in, to try to ensure that people don't try to crawl to those specific files and, look for things that they shouldn't be messing with. So the first thing we're doing is creating a file called notification bar PHP, and that's going to live in that notification bar folder. And in that file, the first thing that we need to do to get started is create some header comments for our plugin. So I did mention in the intro to this presentation that I would expect some basic HTML and CSS knowledge, but I don't really expect PHP knowledge or JavaScript knowledge. Most of the things that we're going to do here I can walk through with you, and I hope that they're fairly straightforward. So this is a standard comment that any WordPress plugin is going to have. If we place it between these slashes and asterisks here, it's going to be not read, not compiled by PHP. It's just going to be treated as a comment. But these ones, in particular for WordPress plugins, are used to create the information about that plugin, all the metadata for it. So we have the name that we're giving our plugin, the URL for where the plugin's from, normally a business website, or a link specifically to that plugin, where people can purchase it or download it, find new information about it. This description is what's going to display to people who are installing or activating or deactivating the plugin. The version number is going to be important because this version number is used to determine if there are updates to the plugin. So if I decide to rewrite this plugin later, if I change the version number in this file, assuming that I have it uploaded somewhere that WordPress is going to look for it, it will tell me that there's an update and be able to use the update features. The author, in this case, it is my WordPress.org username. I'm just treating this as if I uploaded this to WordPress.org for people to download. And then you can also have a URL specific to the author. So this can be separate of, say the business in my example. So we've written this bit of code here, which is a comment. And what does this look like on our site? This is what WordPress install would look like, assuming that we don't have any plugins installed. And after we've created that file, made sure that it's in the proper folder, saved it, we can refresh this page. And now we have that information available. And we can see that it has the name of the plugin that we gave it, that description, version number, and then these two links here will be the links that we provided. And so we already have a working WordPress plugin. Of course, it doesn't really do anything, but we have something that we can take and activate in our site. So you can see here that I clicked activated, and now whatever code that we add to this plugin is going to be running on this site. And sorry, while I take a drink of water, if anyone does have any questions during the presentation, your audio is available to jump in. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is create a place for the settings for our plugin. So we have a create. We're going to make a text field where people can enter whatever text is going to display in our notification bar. And then we're going to create a radio button to choose whether it shows up at the top or bottom of the site. So to create that settings page, we're going to add a menu item to WordPress. Now this first part here, we're going to be seeing a lot of throughout this presentation. So I want to make sure that I go over it. On line number 5 here, we have a function called add action. This is a built-in WordPress function. That means that you can use this anywhere in WordPress, and it's going to be able to parse it, understand what it does. The add action function has a few arguments. That's the information that's here in the parentheses. I'm using the first 2 arguments that are available for it. This one here, admin_menu, this tells me where this action should be used. And I'll go over that in just a moment. And then the second one here, WNB general settings page, this tells me what we're going to do for this action. You'll notice that this portion here, WNB general settings page, is the same as the function that we're creating on line 6. So built into WordPress, there's a lot of areas where you can insert your own code. Those are called hooks in WordPress. and a lot of other frameworks and programming languages use the same terminology. The idea is that WordPress itself is going to run. It's going to go through all the steps that it takes to load a page. And then when it gets to a specific hook, in this case, admin menu, it's going to check to see if there's any other code available to run. And it's going through, over 1,000 of these built into WordPress itself every time a page loads. Additionally, plugins and themes can add their own hooks if you want to make it so that other people can make changes. A good example is WooCommerce, the WordPress e-commerce platform. It has a lot of hooks built in so that people can change the look of the shopping cart or of the payment page, as an example. So what I'm telling here on line 5 is when we get to this hook, admin menu, look for something called WNB general settings page. On line 6, we've started that function. On line 7, we are using another built-in function called add submenu page. So again, this is all PHP code that we're looking at. This is all PHP code that we're looking at. And all the information about these can be found in the WordPress.org plugin handbook. The link at the bottom here of my presentation has some references on where to find all this information. So I'm not going to click through all those pages now, just because there's a lot of detailed information there. But I highly recommend using those handbooks whenever you're working on WordPress code. I don't have all of these things memorized myself. I don't think anyone would want to memorize all of the different functions built in. So it's a good reference to remind you of what's there. So add submenu page, I have a few different arguments that I'm passing to it. Again, when I say arguments, I'm talking about all of the different information that function's going to use that's in these parentheses. The first one is what page it's going to be a submenu page for. I'm choosing the options-general.php, which is the settings page in WordPress. The next screenshot I'll show you will show you what that looks like. Below that, on lines 9 and 10, this does look like I'm just duplicating something, but specifically one of these is the menu title. So what's going to show up as the title of this page in the menu, and then what's going to show up as the title of the page when you get to that page. So these two can be something different depending on what your plugin should look like. Now the reason that lines 9 and 10 are wrapped in these other parentheses with 2 underscores in front of them, that is used for translation purposes in WordPress. So if you are going to try to submit a plugin for other people to use, you're going to need to add these translation functions along with a translation string. So you're going to see the notification -bar a lot in this plugin. Basically, it's saying whenever you get to something that looks like this, look for the localization package for notification bar and see if we need to change the text that's in this first set of quotation marks. So for example, this plugin right here, somebody could translate it into Spanish, Russian, French, Japanese, another language, and they can use this translation string right here to signify which plugin it's for. Below that, on line 11, we're giving the capability that somebody needs to have to see the submenu page. Manage options is normally something only administrators of the site have, so that's a very common one if you want administrator only access. Line 12, we're creating, this one is the callback that we're going to use. Or no, I'm sorry, line 12, we are creating the string here that we're going to use for all of our options on that page, the slug that we're going to use, and line 13 is a callback for that page. The callback is just saying what function we're going to use to render things on that page. So we're not going to see either of these two until we get to the next set of code. So we've taken this bit of code here, we've saved it below the comments in that first file that we created. I guess this is a good point to say that we're creating something that's just functional PHP. We're not going to use any object-oriented programming here. We're trying to keep this one, a simple, lightweight plugin. I would certainly recommend learning that and doing it for the future if you already know PHP or if you already know programming and are familiar with object-oriented code. I would highly recommend doing that, especially if you're building a larger plugin. But in this case, again, I want this one to be something simpler to follow along with. So we've taken this bit of code here, we've saved it, and we're going to refresh our page. And now we see that we have under the settings page, which again is the options general PHP page, we have a link to a page called notification bar that shows up at the bottom. So that's working, but we also see that we have a warning on the page here. It's saying that we expect a valid callback, WNB render settings page, and it's not found. So remember how I said that over here we have a callback to what's going to display on this page? We haven't actually written that code yet. So of course, when we refresh the page here, it's not going to be able to find what we're looking for, and it's going to give us this warning. But that's okay, we're about to write that now. All right, so the next step is going to be to render our settings page. So we have this function that we're creating, WNB render settings page. As a reminder, that is the callback that we put in the add submenu page function. And we're going to write a little bit of HTML here. By default, WordPress uses a div called wrap to wrap all of the contents for a settings page. So I'm going to be using that same div. That way I can take advantage of all the styling that's built into WordPress pages. I'm creating a header that is going to display the title, notification bar settings. It is using that same translation string if we need it. And instead of using these this double X underscore, we're using a function called escape HTML and then echoing it out. Basically, it's just saying that we are going to sanitize anything that's in here so that we don't write any bad code in our title. And then we're going to create a form because our settings page is going to have the text box and radio button options. What our form is going to do is it's going to post. That just means that we're going to submit. It's going to save, refresh this page. And it's going to return us to the same page that we're on here, this options page. So we are going to set up some settings fields. This is going to be, again, where our text box and radio buttons come in. We're going to use this other function, do settings section. This is going to actually do all of the logic that makes those fields work, actually displays those, the inputs and handles saving and pulling them from the database. And then of course our form has to have some sort of submit button so that we can hit save. So all this bit of code here is just creating a box that we're going to put a settings form in. So again, we're going to take the same code, we'll save it. When we refresh our page, we're not seeing an error anymore. Now we're seeing the title of the page and our button to save changes. We could have done things like, make a fancier looking page. We can style it in a specific way. We can change how this button looks or what it says. But I want to keep everything the way that WordPress will make it look by default so that it keeps the same user interface that people are familiar with. If you've ever used a plugin or theme that kind of really makes WordPress look totally different, it can be a little frustrating sometimes to figure out why things aren't loading properly. Sometimes they'll use like a custom font that doesn't load. I've seen some that just change the UI entirely, and it also changes the admin bar here, and it can be really jarring. So I'm going to try to avoid any of that. So now that we've created our form, a few different things that we need to do. First, we need to create a settings section. Basically, this is going to be a place where all of the different settings that we create go. So an example, I used WooCommerce as an example before. You might have a settings section for tax information, settings section for shipping information, one for licensing the plugin if you're using settings section for store business information, things that will show up, on the shopping page as an example. So the reason that there's a whole section for all of your settings, as opposed to just putting them all in one place, is you might have different pages where they show up or different parts of the page where they show up, and you want to make sure that you can pull just the fields that you need on each page. We're only going to be creating one section today. We also need to create the field. That's our checkboxes, radio buttons, text boxes, text areas, any different form fields that we would have. And then we need to register those fields. basically we need to create a radio button that's going to say, display our notification at the top or bottom of the screen, and we need to tell it how it's going to the WordPress database so that we can use that information later. So again, we're using a WordPress hook. We're using admin init this time, so it just means whenever an administrative page is initialized. And then the callback we're going to use is WNB initialize settings. You can title these things whatever you want. I'm using the prefix of WNB, WordPress notification bar, just to ensure that we don't have any functions with the same name competing with one another. And just you need to make sure that this callback here matches the function name that you're creating. So within our function where we're initializing settings, so again, the settings are where different input fields are going to go. I am creating an ID for that section, a title for what the section is going to be called. Again, I don't really have a specific title here, but let's say it's a larger, more complex plugin, you might need to have multiple sections to display. A callback, so another function that's going to render all of the different section settings. And then we need to choose what page we're going to add it on. And if we remember back from a few screens, we created this page here when we were first registering the page. Sorry, we created this slug here when we were first registering the page. All this means is we're going to make sure that our fields show up on the page that we've created, not on some other page. Now that we've registered the section and we have our callback to fill that section in, we're going to add a settings field. So again, these are the fields, these are the actual form fields that we're going to be using. So we are getting to that point of having specific form fields displayed on the screen. So I'm creating an ID for this so that we can use this to look for our field later. Again, this is what's going to display as the name of that field. This callback right here, we're going to go over creating in a moment. It's going to be how we're going to render a text box. We have to put the same page and the section that it's going to go on. And finally, I'm passing an array of options. This is information about the specific field that we're creating. I will go over why we're doing it this way when we get to the next step. It'll make a little more sense to show that we're going to make one specific callback to create all text boxes. That way, if we want to create more text boxes in the future, we don't need to keep rewriting all of that code. I'm doing the same thing here for a radio button. So it's going to look pretty similar. We're going to have a specific ID for that, some text for it. It's going to be a radio button. So we're going to create a function here to make radio buttons. Same page, same section. And then that array is going to have a little bit more information because we have a few more things that go into a radio button field. So as an example, we have 3 different options that we're creating. They're going to be an option to not display our notification bar, to display it at the top of the page, or display at the bottom of the page. Finally, the last of the 3 parts of this step, we have all of those settings that we created. Now we need to register those settings. So basically we need to say anything that falls under this setting, the settings page, we're going to save to this settings section. This portion right here is where it's going to live in the options table of the WordPress database. If anyone's looked at the WordPress database itself before, there's a lot of different tables that are built in that display posts, comments, users, metadata for all of those. There's also an important table called WP options that has options for plugins, for themes, anything else that registers specific things that you want to pull at multiple places on the site. So we're going to save to that options table our title of our notification bar and the display settings for it. That way, when the page loads, it can go to that options table, look for any information under this name, and return it to us. All right, so I've taken those 3 bits of code that we made before, saved them to our plugin file, reloaded the page, and it's looking a little bit better. We see the text here for the text field and the radio buttons, but we also see these errors again. we're expecting a valid callback for the text input and radio input. And then this one we'll be doing next. I just had it in screenshot already. So this, again, the same reason we've created this callback here, but we haven't actually written the code for it, which is why we're getting that error. So the next step for us to do is to write the code that's going to make a text input and a radio input display. Oh, and nope, sorry. The next thing we're going to do is create a header for the settings section. This one doesn't really matter as much for us only having one settings section, but I just want to show that it's a fairly simple thing to do. If you use the callback that we've created for that settings section, which if we jump back a few screens, it's at the start of registering that section. We can add some HTML here. In this case, I'm just adding, a title for that section. It's not really important in our case, but it could be very important if you are creating a tabbed layout page. I'm using WooCommerce again as an example just because it's a popular plugin, so there's a better chance that you might have seen what the settings section for that looks like. It's a tabbed page that has multiple screens of different sections, and this is where we would start rendering all of that information where we'd use it. In this case, I'm just making a title for that section. It doesn't look very impressive right now. It's just a bit of extra text that shows up, but you can see having places to put that HTML code in could allow you to really change the layout of this page. All right, so now we're going to finally render those text boxes and the radio buttons. So reminder, when I created the text field, I told it that it was going to use the text input callback right here. So I'm creating that function now. And the argument that we're passing to that function is all of the options that were pulled from the settings section. So I'm going to jump back really quick. I'll just go to the text one. So this array here, these are all the parameters that are going to that callback function: label for, option group, and option ID. So by having this argument here, by having, sorry, if I keep switching between using argument and parameter, in this case I'm using them interchangeably. By using that parameter here, we can then take all of the information from that array, the option group, ID, and name, and we're going to assign the values there to variables of our own. So the reason that we're doing this is, let's say that we've already written some text in our notification bar. We want to ensure that when we refresh the page, that same text is going to appear and that it's available for us to use. And we want to make sure that when we hit submit, it'll save that text to the database. So all of this text, all of this information here is simply to get the values that already exist from the database, if they exist. So in this case, we're checking to see if values exist. And then we're going to render the output for that. Basically, we're going to create a text input, and the ID, name, and value for that text input are going to be whatever data we pull from the database. The reason that the reason that I wrote it like this is some plugins, you're going to have a lot of text fields or radio buttons, checkboxes. So you're going to want to ensure that you don't have to keep rewriting this whole bit of code over and over again. Instead of just have a function here that we can reuse. I added another example, kind of got a sneak peek in that screenshot, that we're going to add a second radio button, and then we won't have to rewrite all that code again. The same thing happens here for the radio button. I'm not going to go through all of it. Basically, it's pulling all that same info from the database, and then it's going to output a radio field. The only major difference here, besides the input type, is we are going to pull all of the different radio button options that exist, and then we're going to loop through all of them with a for each loop. So we're just going to make sure that all of the different options that go as part of one radio group appear on the page. So in the example that we have display none, display at top of the page, and display at the bottom of the page. So we have our text and radio input callbacks. Now when we look at that page again, we can see that our text field now appears. We're not getting an error there anymore. And the radio buttons appear. And when we fill that information out, so I wrote some text, I chose some options. Again, we're going to look at this second option in a second. I just wanted to show how we could start with one option and then add new ones on. I can save the page, it's going to refresh, and all of the info that I've saved is going to display again. So we have all of our options saved to the database. We have our settings page that we can put our notification bar text and where it's going to display. Now we need to actually display that on the front end of the site. So I'm using a built-in WordPress hook called WP Footer. This is one that every theme should have in it. I can't guarantee that every theme will have it, but any theme that you get from the WordPress.org repository or any theme sales site hopefully should have this. It's something that every WordPress theme should have, but we can't technically force people to have. But I'm going to assume 99.9% of the time this will be there in your theme. So I was just saying when this appears in the theme in WP Footer, normally this goes before the closing body tag on the page, we're going to look for this function, WNB display notification bar. And the first thing that we're doing is we're ensuring if the options that we've set are not null, so if there is something that exists in the database, this get option function is a WordPress built-in function that says go to the options table in the database and look for an option with this slug, which if we remember from a few steps ago, we created and said that all of our settings we're going to go into. So if that's not null, then get those options from the database. And everything is wrapped in the if statement here because we don't want to display any of this HTML if it isn't there. So I've just created a little bit of HTML here. We're going to create a div. I put this on 2 lines so it all show on one screen, but it should be, 9 and 10 should be on the same line. What we're doing is we're taking the options. So we've created this variable called $options. And in that, we're going to grab the display location. So if we remember in our radio button, we had those 3 different locations we selected. What this is going to do is create a class of notification bar and then add another class to that div of whatever the display location is. That way we can use that for styling in CSS. The same thing below, we're going to have a div wrapped in that notification bar that is going to echo out the text for the text that appears in the options for our notification bar. So we remember that we wrote hello CMS Philly in there. And we said we're going to display this in WP Footer. So I'm going to go to the site. This is the front end of the site. I'm going to hit refresh. And I can see that the text that we added is here on the front end of the site. Now it's at the very bottom of the page and it's unstyled because we haven't actually added any CSS to style the page. So that's what we're going to do next. We need to create and then load a style sheet for this plugin. The WP and Q scripts hook is built into WordPress. We're going to add our own function, and then we're going to use WP and Q style. That is another built-in function. We're going to supply a slug. This is just how we're going to reference that style sheet. We're going to say, look where this current file is. So this notification bar.php file. And then in the folder that this file is in, look for a file called notification bar.css. And here we could have an array of dependencies. So like we want to make sure this loads before or after, after specific other style sheets, but I don't have any. And then this version number here is used for caching purposes. So, if I change the version number here, it will remove it from the cache, or rather it will reference a new URL. So assuming that you aren't caching query strings, which you're not going to be by default in WordPress, it'll load a new version of this page. This is in case we update the plugin and we want to make sure that all the updated styles and scripts go along with it. And then there's just some basic CSS. Again, if you have some familiarity with CSS, it'll be a lot easier to change the styling. In this case, I'm just making a full width, black background, white text, aligned center bar. We see we have these other classes that we created here. If it's on top, it'll go on top. If it's on bottom, it's on bottom. And then if we're logged in and there's a min bar, I added a little bit of spacing so that it would show up at the proper height. So we remember that I took our text and I said display on the top of the site, go to the home page and hit refresh, and now we see that it's in a black bar, white text, displaying at the top of the site. And I want to remind you that we can add new options easy now that we've created those callbacks. So basically I want to make sure at the display at the top of the page or at the bottom of the page, no matter where you are on the page, as opposed to specifically at the top or bottom of the entire page. So if we scroll, the text will stay on the screen. So what I've done is created a new settings field. This right here is pretty much a copy and paste of our last radio button. The only thing that I need to change is the labels, what it says for the label, and whatever options we have. I put sticky and relative, basically make it sticky or make it not sticky. But again, I already have the radio input callback created. So once I add this settings field, I won't need to write any other code to add the new radio buttons on the page. I did update the PHP that displays that notification bar. So now we have the location class that we created last time. And now we also have whether it's sticky or not class. And then finally add a little bit of CSS that just chooses whether it's fixed or sticky. So in this case, I know it's hard to see from just a screenshot alone, but I'm scrolled partway up a page in a comment section. I chose to display the bottom of the page, and we see that it's still displaying on screen as opposed to being at the very bottom of the screen. And I want to pause before we move on to this bonus content here and just ensure, does anyone have any questions on what I've covered so far in the presentation? And again, a reminder that all of the code is available to go through at your leisure, because I realized I kind of went a little bit quickly through it. And I'm going to start going through this bonus section here, but you can use voice chat or the chat box on the sidebar if you have any questions about what's been covered or something else about plugin building. So we've created this settings page where we can add these text fields and radio buttons, but a lot of plugins and themes now use the customizer. So this is a different API built into WordPress. If you're logged into a site looking at a page, you'll see at the top of the black admin bar that displays, there's the word customize. If you click that, a new interface opens that is more JavaScript heavy. By that I mean everything's going to be rendered on screen live using JavaScript, as opposed to the PHP that we've written so far. So I just want to show you what we're going to do to change the settings that we've created. That's that text box and those two radio buttons, from using the settings API to using the customizer API. Thankfully, we've done most of the work of the plugin, so we actually don't need to do a lot of changes here. I'm pointing out that we've changed this call to the options table to now be a call to a built-in WordPress function, get theme mod. This one just looks for a setting that is saved in the customizer. So I'm pointing out that this saves in the options table as its own setting. This one saves as all the theme modifications in the options table. So we are going to need to save new settings to the database, which also means that any settings that we've created on that settings page are going to be ignored in the new customizer section that we're creating. Now the customizer section, I'm not going to walk line through all of this code. I'm just going to point out that I'm using, again, a hook to get to the customizer page. And what I'm using as the parameters for that callback that we're creating, WNB customize register, is a built-in class for the customizer for WordPress. And then we're going to add all of our different arguments here, the sections, the settings, and the controls. These are the same sections, settings, and fields that we've created before, but this time we get to use a built-in API that WordPress has for the customizer. So again, all this information here is going to look the same. It's just a little bit different format because we're putting it all into this one function that's using a built-in class. So this is before I made those changes to the plugin. We can see this customize page here that has all of the built-in customizer sections. Now I've added our code and saved it. And when I refresh the page, we can see a new section called notification bar that we've created that appears here. I'm going to click into that, and we see that the same fields that we created, the radio buttons and the text area, are here for us to use as well. So as a reminder, this information here does not sync with what's on that settings page. We would be using one of these or the other, either the customizer or the settings page. You can write it so that they will both display. In this case, I just wanted to show an example of a different way that we could write this. That's why I'm calling this like bonus content at the end. So you would choose one or the other to make these changes. So I've created all this content here. I've noticed I've changed the text. I've decided not to make it sticky, so we're at the very top of the page and it's displaying at the top. But the cool thing is if you were to click these radio buttons now, or if you were to change this text, it's going to show up live on the screen while you're editing without you having to hit save. When you are ready to save your changes, you would hit publish up here, but you can see what it's going to look like before you actually publish it. And that's why I try to write more of my plugins using the customizer if it's settings that we're going to look at on the front end, and use the settings API if it's things that are back-end settings. Like for instance, again, those tax settings or shipping settings that you're only going to see on the back end in WooCommerce. And that is it. I want to make sure that we definitely had time at the end for a few questions. So if anybody has any, please jump in. And I believe y'all should have the ability to use your microphone to ask questions right now. Or to shuffle things around. Like I said, I realized that we covered a lot. While I pull this, I'm going to get out of full screen here for just a second. Right now, I'm showing that link that is at the bottom of all the slides goes to a GitHub repository, and there's information on how to use it, some of what we're going to be covering, and also a link to the developer handbook. Also, if you've never used GitHub before or a Git version control system, we have what's called commits here. Basically, it's all the different pieces of code that were saved at specific times. What I've done is I've made these commits to go along with all of the different steps that we covered. So you can see, you'd start at the bottom since we're working reverse chronologically here, and you can see all the different steps and any bit of code that was added or any bit of code that was removed while writing this plugin. So you could follow along, step by step and see each different thing that we've created. And again, a link to that is right here. And I know I heard some other audio, so I'm going to assume that that's working. I guess I'll just give another minute if no one has any other questions. Thank you all for coming, and I hope that you enjoyed the start of CMS Philly and the rest of the day. All right, have a good day, everybody.